Hey everyone, welcome to this podcast called Ken Reads, where I, Ken, read out your letter that you've shared with me in the hopes that I can better help you understand what the F just happened between you and the last partner you were dating, whether it was in a relationship or a situationship. I look at these experiences from the lens of attachment theory. I don't just come up with thought terminating cliches like, they're just not that into you, or if they wanted to, they would. While some of those phrases might have their benefit in other dynamics, I try and look at this from the lens of, is there perhaps an insecure attachment issue that's at play in these particular dynamics? And though I am an Australian counsellor, I am not someone who is going to be responding to these letters as if I was with a client. I'm here to provide validation, yes, but I can't provide any diagnoses on these. So even if, a lot of people might understandably hear this and be like, well, that sounds like a narcissist. At best, I'll probably say, sounds a bit narky. I probably won't go any further than that out of respect to my ethical boundaries in regards to what I can and can't do. If you find this of benefit to you, fantastic. That's what I want. And if you want to submit your letter, you're very welcome to, once there is obviously availability per month. And I'll happily read out and share my own 2 cents as to what I think has gone on in your dating experience to offer you a sense of validation for what you've been through, and also to give other people listening a chance to feel like maybe this relates to what they've also experienced as part of collective healing. So with that all out of the way, let's dive in to the latest letter. So for our next letter, we have a letter from Melissa. And before I dive into this, I want to once again reintroduce my teammate, Amy. Amy, would you like to remind everyone who you are and what you do?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm so happy to be back. I am an attachment healing coach on Ken's team, and I work with people through breakups and healing attachment insecurity.
And we're both here to dive into Melissa's letter. So let's get straight into it. We're both 50 and met 5 years ago when I moved in next door. Paul was a farmer and self-employed salesman. He was breathtakingly handsome with a boyish shyness about him. I was attracted to him. We chatted often and he sometimes invited me for tea. He had divorced 5 years before, which had been tough on the kids. They stayed with him every other week. He was hardworking and seemed uncomplicated. We were both introverts and loved hiking. And after some months, he began sending increasingly flirtatious texts. Messages came daily, often late at night, then stopped for weeks before resuming. I reciprocated, looking forward to his texts. In person, however, he just acted like a friendly neighbor. Confused, I confronted him about this. He admitted he just acted like a friendly. Oh, sorry. He admitted being attracted but not daring to act on it. He'd had several relationships since the divorce, but always ended things feeling guilty towards his kids. We ended up getting intimate, but agreed to take things slowly. He came over 2 to 3 nights during child-free weeks. He never called, only texted. Sex was passionate and somewhat extreme, often lasting many hours, like he had something to prove. He was sweet and caring. Some months in, I told him I was falling in love. He said he loved to be with me, but wasn't used to hearing or expressing words of love and didn't want to label us. He would say, "You give me peace like no one else has." He loved holding me and stroking my hair when we fell asleep. I never knew if and when we'd meet. He disliked planning and often arrived late, blaming work or just sitting at home staring at the wall. His unpredictability made me feel anxious. I was crushed when he didn't show. I fled home not to see him hosting parties I wasn't invited to. I'm going to take a pause here. Amy, what are your thoughts on just this beginning part? Because I feel like in such a short space of time, there's already a lot of writing on the wall.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of writing on the wall indicating that Paul has an avoidant attachment style,
Yeah.
likely dismissive avoidant. And, as is so often the case with avoidant attachment, it is so clear, being that there is such little variability in terms of behaviors, language, emotions, and patterns. And you can see the things that are really jumping out to me is that he's had several relationships since the divorce, but he always ends things, that he wanted to take things slowly after you said, you were falling in love. And that's not necessarily avoidant. That can be completely normal and healthy. But, it's interesting. He said, "You give me peace like no one else." And that is so heartwarming. And actually, peace and harmony are one of the absolute biggest avoidant needs in relationship. And then, of course, his reluctance to give the relationship a label, even though things were seemingly going really well. What do you think, Ken?
I completely agree on the note of the label. We've, discussed this, not just you and I, Amy, but like across letters. I've talked a lot about how it's a bit of a red flag when you've been seeing someone for a while and they're refusing labels. It's sort of just like, why are we withholding this? Like, what's going on? Like I understand that sometimes labels aren't everyone's thing. I get that aspect, but I also want to know why. Because to me, I'm thinking, what's the hang up here? If it was an issue where it was like, oh, look, I have some uncomfortability around labels. Here's my reasons why. Well, that's perfectly fine to talk about, hash it out. But that's a conversation that should have been had maybe at the beginning. I just feel like this came out of nowhere. And then he's also saying to you, but you give me peace like no one else has. Already, there's two sides of him, right? There's him basically giving you this reassurance and this intimacy where he's indicating that he really has a lot of strong positive regard for you. Yet I just feel like he's also holding back and not wanting to be fully invested. And there was something else that was here that, oh, yeah, this is what I was going to talk about. Speaking of two sides, it's odd that he was also sending you increasingly flirtatious texts, yet would act like, completely, like he would act normal when you were interacting with him until you brought it to his attention. Like it's something that I've heard a lot of, and I see a lot sometimes in cases where I'm working with someone who's avoidantly attached, is a lot of them are very big into impression management. And I think they at times struggle to reconcile these different parts of themselves that come out, if you will. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with the language that I'm using, I am not suggesting that Paul has multiple personality disorder. What I'm referring to is the fact that it's very common for people who are dating avoidant attachers who are particularly on the severe end to notice, like when they're interacting with them, it's like you always feel like there's an oscillation between two parts: yearning for connection, fear. And I feel like in the moments where you're apart, he's all in, being very sexual. But then when you get close, it's like he's acting platonic and friendly. What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
I couldn't agree more, and I'm so happy that you pointed that out, because if there were one indication, or sort of the biggest plight, I would say, of people with avoidant attachment, is that very thing that you were just describing, which is the constant, and very jarring, battle between the feelings and the fears. And this shows up in his behavior, like you were just saying, how he was really warm and flirtatious, but then would be cold and distant. And the sad thing about this is, not only is this extremely painful and confusing for the person on the receiving end, for you, Melissa, but it's also really, really painful for avoidance to be in this space too, because so often, unless they have a deep understanding of attachment, they don't understand what is happening and why their feelings keep sort of flip-flopping. And they kind of have this sort of sadness already, kind of knowing that it's going to go wrong because
Yes.
this is the pattern. And they so often don't feel empowered to change it. And another thing that I don't know if we mentioned this, but that's kind of heartbreaking also, is that when you told him that you were falling in love, he said he wasn't used to hearing or expressing words of love. And if you look at that closely, he's not just saying I'm not used to expressing. He first said I'm not used to hearing it. And that is sort of a place of the sort of original attachment injury. Part of it for avoidance is that in childhood, when they reached out for love and for emotional connection and attunement, it wasn't provided. So, this is all just very telling.
Yep. I think that even though we're only a few months in based on Melissa's letter, it just seems like, some of those things, which I think you will agree with me, Amy, it's like you sort of just after you hear about a lot of these cases, right? And you also understandably work with avoidant clients where, depending on the severity and also the mildness too, you just can spot the signs. You're like, ah, yep, that's very real. That's very common. But I have to say, out of compassion to Paul in this instance, I do feel sorry for for people like him where there is this big oscillation of big parts that are coming out because that just sounds like it would be hell to have like, these big flip-flops of emotion. And I can understand the helplessness around it. Now, I understand listeners who are, hearing us may not necessarily feel this way because they're understandably grieving off the back of a bad breakup. Totally fair. They don't have to agree with what we're talking about here out of compassion. But that's neither here nor there. The point simply is, I do feel sorry for people who have this experience because it must be awful to constantly battle these big emotions and also feel helpless to be able to navigate it. Anyways, let's continue. This paragraph actually caught my eye, and I wanted to almost read it out immediately, but I felt like we had some stuff to cover before. So Melissa continues, Paul suffered from chronic fatigue and tremors, which he said worsened around his ex-wife and kids, but lessened around me. As to why his marriage ended, he said she had cheated on him and left him, quote unquote, out of the blue. During the divorce, he'd lost 40 pounds. In our relationship, his ex was always in the periphery as she needed him for practical and emotional support. I asked whether he wanted her back. He answered, she's always treated me badly, but I'd reconcile for the kids. He joked, I guess the reason why I don't have a girlfriend is I still have to take care of my ex. This hurt as we've been together for months. Actually, I'm going to pause there. That is a very big red flag to me because it makes me feel like he's using his ex as a placeholder to not actually face intimacy and be with another person. What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
Yes, and it's actually really interesting because so often, and I wonder if this is the case here, so often people with avoidant attachment find it easier to provide emotional support or care to someone once they know that they are sort of out of commitment with them. So, you know, and he says she cheated on him and she left out of the blue. Now, of course, we don't have enough details to really understand what happened here, but a long marriage doesn't usually end out of the blue. There's writing on the wall. There are things that happen. So this is all, I think, a little concerning and definitely a red flag. Um, it's kind of highlighting maybe some emotional immaturity and definitely sort of a lack of awareness. And to your point, your original question, I do think this can absolutely be used and probably is as a convenient placeholder or buffer between you and between he and you, Melissa.
I completely agree. So Melissa continues, 6 months in, he withdrew, depressed due to financial problems. He rejected my help, preferring to suffer alone. He vanished for a month, though I saw him drive by daily. Just as I thought it was over, he asked to meet. When I arrived, he was undressed and initiated sex. I craved emotional connection, but didn't object, relieved to have him back. He apologized that, quote unquote, our increasing closeness scared me, but I'm fine now. He said he felt grateful to be with me. Well, I feel like each of these paragraphs has so much depth to them that I just can't help but, unpack these. That's pretty much, I mean, he pretty much just said a lot right there, didn't he?
Oh yeah, he pretty much said I have avoidant attachment. Um, even with the lack of sort of warming up and then just initiating sex, it's very interesting. Oftentimes, avoidants have kind of extreme relationships with sex. It's
Right.
either they're kind of very disconnected for one set of reasons. I won't waste time going into it, or they just use sex as a complete bridge. And kind of as a buffer to emotional connection. So I'm kind of getting that sense here.
Agreed. And I also will say one last thing too is again, there's that feeling of helplessness, preferring to suffer alone, and also financial problems. Maybe we'll talk more about that another time, but dismissives and financial problems, they go hand in hand. And usually it's not unexpected for them to suffer financial issues later in life because what a surprise, their relational issues have finally caught up with them and they're not so great at managing their finances. Anyways, Melissa writes, things improved. We took trips and spent more time together. A year in, I had major surgery. He picked me up and stayed for 5 nights to take care of me. Then he said, I need space. I'm feeling miserable. His ex and kids were pressuring him to join their vacation. He lay on my bed crying. He disappeared for 6 weeks but never went on vacation. When he ignored me in public, I broke down and demanded to meet. He apologized for being a jerk and for having had a quote unquote meltdown. I begged him to stop disappearing and he promised to try and said, "You're too sweet and patient with me." Despite my recent surgery, we got intimate, which led to complications and rehospitalization. He never visited, saying he was tired. Much later, I learned that his friend's wife worked at the hospital. I suspected he was scared to bump into her as he was keeping our relationship a secret. Weeks later, he suggested I meet his boys for his birthday, which gave me hope. He behaved silly, and I could tell he had drunk. I was with them several times during fall, and he seemed happy and relieved, telling me that the boys were fine with me. He was very loving and caring. Sex had become less intimate and more experimental. His fantasies involved threesomes or groups or watching me with another man. I refused, saying that seeing him touch another woman would crush me. Our texting had developed to be mostly sexting. I dreaded his next disappearance. Once while fantasizing about, sorry, once about what? Jesus. Once while fantasizing about selling his home and living in a trailer, he joked there wouldn't be room for me or the kids. In December, he said his ex and kids forced him to spend Christmas with them. I left town to avoid seeing them. Over the holidays, he texted briefly that he wasn't in a good mood. We'd planned to spend New Year's together, but he cancelled, needing time alone. I saw his ex and kids arrive to celebrate with him. After 2 months of no contact, I confronted him and he broke up with me. He cried, saying he couldn't stand letting me down and that I deserved better. He said his ex and kids had bragged about their money and he felt like a failure financially and as a man. He banged his head on the table, saying he wanted to be alone and felt unworthy of me. To get away from him, I moved to another part of town. All right, we're going to take a pause here. There is so much stuff going on here that was also written way back when you first connected. Low self-esteem, hopelessness, issues with money, incredible shame around who he is. The fact that he's banging his head against the wall, like the table like that, just man, this man must have an extreme inner critic. Amy, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yes, I agree. And also this very like highly um, emotionally dysregulated behavior also makes me think that he might even have some fearful avoidant attachment in him.
Yes. Yes.
Definitely.
I was thinking that too. In fact, as this went on, I was like, this is sounding more like dismissive leaning FA.
Completely. And the reason why we say that is because, dismissive avoidants aren't often going to display this wide range of emotional behavior in front of you. They're not going to bang their head against the wall or cry hysterically in front of you in most cases. And, I think I'm sensing there might be a drinking problem going on, which is not, specific to any attachment style, although a lot of avoidant people do unfortunately have dependency on substance. But it's heartbreaking. My heart is really broken for you, Melissa, because what I'm seeing here is somebody who has very deep, very obviously genuine feelings of love for you and who wants to be with you in some capacity. And I also feel like he is extremely disempowered in
Mm.
having control over his life. His ex-wife seems to be controlling his life. And of course, you know, people's kids, I believe, should absolutely come first. So I'm not even going to comment on them because, his kids should come first. But there's a healthy way if he had the tools and the emotional stability, I think, and the secure attachment to find a way to make it work. And it's sad because you can hear in his language when he says, I'm just going to hurt you or you deserve better than me. I think that he truly believes that. And it's sad that zoomed out, we can see or we suspect, but these things can be worked out. And if you just had conversations and shifted things around, and he clearly feels very disempowered to adjust his life to make this work. And I don't think it's for lack of desire. That's not the feeling I'm getting. I think he just lacks the tools. What do you think, Ken?
I think as soon as you said tools, my instantly thought he lacks boundaries. Like to me, I mean, that's one of many things he lacks. But I feel like Paul, as you said, is so dysregulated. He's also shown signs of boomeranging. Like, he's shown multiple signs of boomeranging. And I feel like he doesn't have boundaries with his ex-wife. His ex-wife might as well be his mum at this stage, right? Like, I feel as though, the fact that he allows his ex-wife to have the role that she has, not just as a co-parent, there feels like there's more to it than that. It feels almost like, as you said, there's a degree of helplessness around this, almost as if he just can't break free and, be able to, work through this. And I feel that speaks to the fact that he's, banging his head, the fact that he's, very emotional about a lot of this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if this man, has tremendous, dysregulation and pain about who he is. And I wouldn't be surprised if he also has moments of being quite explosive from time to time as well, too. He might take a lot of his resentment from the marriage and probably his own family out on you, Melissa. That's just what I'm sensing from this. So let's continue. Melissa writes, 6 months later, I was starting to feel better. While walking my dog, I ran into him. He looked miserable and disheveled. Later, I remembered the smell of alcohol. He said he'd missed me every day and that he loved me. Begging for another chance, he promised everything would be different. He'd introduce me to his family and friends, take me on vacations, and build a real relationship. During our separation, he'd been on vacation with his ex-wife and kids and attended a concert with her. He insisted there was nothing between them. I made him promise that when feeling the urge to pull away again, he would rely on us to solve the issue together. He promised. He was loving and attentive, encouraging me to be part of his family. I was with them most days, and he asked me to bring some of my belongings. While cautious at first, I eventually relaxed and trusted him. The boys struck me as very insecure. There were no boundaries or expectations for chores. There you go. Benjamin, 13, still craved hand-holding to sleep and when watching TV. On the other hand, he engaged in violent adult content gaming without his dad objecting. Thomas, who was 19, was often hostile, spending most of his time gaming and criticizing Paul's low-income work. Ooh. Though I eventually got closer to Benjamin, Thomas stayed aloof. I often felt awkward around them. Paul's dad had died some years before, but I met his mum who seemed pushy and controlling. I haven't read this letter, but well, there you go. Like, what did I say? He said his childhood had been happy and carefree. His dad, a man of few words, started taking him to work when he was a little boy. At 12, Paul started as a farmhand doing hard labor. His dad criticized him harshly for any mistakes. Eventually, Paul took over the company, but after his dad's death, financial missteps forced him to sell. I sensed that he carried a deep sense of failure for disappointing his dad. Fair enough. About 3 months into our relationship, he started to become distant. I was unsure whether it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me. He spent more time helping his mum and friends and began supporting a friend's mentally ill son. The kids mirrored his behavior, getting more withdrawn around me. At parties, he left me alone, only reappearing later when drunk, kissing me and dancing wildly. On family outings, he was playful and fun, but sometimes vanished to sit somewhere alone. He was often reckless, speeding with the kids, unbelted and engaging in risky activities. He also encouraged Thomas to speed or get drunk. Okay, I gotta take a pause here. This is fucking trauma town. And I have to be honest, it's rare that I should make a very big statement here. Like, look, when I'm reading these letters out, I often do feel obviously very sorry for the reader, sorry, the letter writer who's sending this in because, you know, it's their experience, their traumatic, breakup that they've gone through. And often I'm providing lots of, validation for the person who writes in. But as I'm reading this is one of the few times where I'm actually, don't get me wrong, I'm very sorry for what Melissa's gone through, but I am actually also just like, Jesus, I feel something's coming out of me saying I'm actually kind of feel sorry for Paul as well, too. Like, it just sounds like this man's gone through some absolute shit. And it just seems like I really feel sorry for like the little boy who's going through this because this just feels like wild. Like, it just really feels, I could just imagine, because I mean, I definitely can relate to some of the emotions that are probably coming out, just how vulnerable he must feel about himself. What are your thoughts, Amy?
Yes, yes, I feel the same way. And it's funny that you said, and I think you're referring to his sons when you say you feel bad for the little boy, but I was actually just
Actually,
thinking that.
I was actually thinking Paul's inner child, but that too.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what I was just gonna say. I was gonna say I was actually thinking I feel bad for the sons, but also I feel bad for Paul's inner child because, as we're reading this, and I forgot that we're talking about a 50-year-old man.
Yes.
Because as it reads, it seems like you are talk and we do not mean this in a derogatory way whatsoever. The opposite. You know, when we have deep attachment wounds, what happens is we sort of become, it's a form of arrested development where we sort of become frozen in time at around the age where these wounds occurred, and especially around things related to these wounds. So, yes, I definitely feel so sorry for Paul's inner child. And, you know, it seems like he is sort of experiencing a little bit of arrested development where when things come up and his wounds get pressed on, and those wounds might be, you know, feeling like a failure or not good enough or fearing intimacy. What happens is when we have these deep attachment wounds, we protect ourselves in the same ways we did in childhood. And again, I kind of forgot that we were reading a letter about a 50-year-old man because his behaviors are screaming woundedness and wounded inner child. And, you know, again, Melissa, this is not at all to invalidate your feelings or to make it seem like he is a victim in this. The thing is, we are all victims of our attachment wounding and our injuries, but we are also all responsible for healing them. And his behaviors are just very, very unhealthy. These interactions with his sons, where he's encouraging them to speed and drink, and the fact that I think he might have a drinking problem. And again, and most importantly to you, Melissa, is like you were saying, Ken, this extreme boomeranging. That is traumatizing for anyone, and extremely painful.
Yep,
What do you
I
think?
completely agree with you. And it also creates that intermittent reinforcement. Like you were out of this for 6 months, living your best life, presumably, before you saw him disheveled again, and he's proclaiming his love for you. Most people who go through this experience would die to hear those words come out of someone. And remember, this is a man who has said to you, I don't usually express feelings of love. Like that's not something that I do. So for him to say that, to imply that at the very least, you know, I think it's one of those things that when you're dating avoidant attachers, there's something inside of us that knows they're not going to be the kind of people that just open up to you overnight, right? Like they're the kind of people that you kind of almost feel like I have to work for this. Like I have to be uber patient to get them to open up. And that can be to our detriment if they're very severe in their attachment wounding. And so I can only imagine there might have been a part of you, Melissa, that was just like, oh my God, you know, like on one hand, absolute hypervigilance, which I've read throughout this because you've obviously been very cautious about getting in too deep again with, you know, with Paul. But at the same time, I could also imagine being like, oh, thank God, like, you know, this, I finally feel like all that effort is paying off and maybe this time it'll be different. But I'm assuming, based on my own experience without having read the rest of this letter, I know, Amy, you've read it. I'm assuming this doesn't get better. In fact, I'd argue it probably gets worse. Because it sounds to me that even though there is strong positive regard for you, man, like this guy's a mess. And even though, as you said, Amy, like it reads, you know, he's obviously in his 50s, it honestly reads like he's in his teens. Like like honestly, when I'm reading this, I'm like, man, and I can also see what he's done with the kids too, right? Like he's, you know, if his mum was controlling, his dad was sending him to work at a young age, which is inappropriate for him at that point in time. Oh, what a surprise. It gives the kids absolute freedom. Makes sense in its own twisted way because he's swung the pendulum too far the other way. And it seems like they also have attachment issues too.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And there you have generational trauma.
Yep.
You know, this is how it is perpetuated, unfortunately. It's very clear from just the bits of information we have on Paul's childhood. It makes sense that he would develop some sort of avoidant attachment, whether that's, we think, sort of a mix of fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant. And something else, and the thing is, again, like you said, Ken, it does get worse as it always will.
Ugh.
Why? Because these are deeply ingrained patterns that don't just magically disappear overnight. And people have to be doing intentional work to shift them. And he doesn't seem like he's anywhere near there. And just one other thing I wanted to point out, and I so agree with you, Ken. You know, Melissa, I can just imagine you on this day walking. 6 months later, you've probably done a good amount of healing work. You're living your life. I think you moved to avoid him, because naturally it would be very painful to live next door to someone. And you bump into him, and then he confesses all this love, which must have sounded amazing. And like you said, so many people would die to have that happen to them with their avoidant ex. But the thing about that, and this is actually a pretty big pattern with avoidant exes, is this reunion, this confession of love. It's reactive. He didn't seek you out. He didn't call you. He didn't email you or text you, ask to have a conversation. You just happened to bump into him and see him, and then this outpouring of love. And I don't point that out to say this must have not been sincere. It probably was very sincere, and he probably was thinking about you, and some forms of shame and fear were preventing him from reaching out to you. But, just the fact that this was reactive and not proactive on his behalf is also a flag, because that tells you, how in control of his life is he? How aligned is he in the way he's living his life, with his truth? Or is he being driven around by his wounded inner child and kind of just, taking things as they come and reacting to life? And, this is the last thing I'll say before we get back to the letter. When we have very deep attachment wounding, we are often living our life in a state of reaction rather than choosing what we want to do and choosing our life and living in a place of our, from our goals and dreams. And it's not our fault. It's just that we are stuck in this place of wounding. And sometimes we don't even understand that we have this choice. And so it's just very sad.
Completely agree. And I just think that, it's it's really tragic because, I could imagine for him, for Paul, this would be the last thing he'd want, right? Like he's lost the capacity to run the company that his dad was running. He's obviously taken the decline of that personally. And for you, and like that's just one of many things that he's grappling with. For you, Melissa, you've invested time, energy, and and it sounds like you really know him. Like, this letter, I feel like I've gotten to know this guy quite intimately because of the way you've written this, which suggests you've really invested so much energy, time, and love to getting to know this guy. You sound like you have a massive heart. You've given this guy many, many chances. And I mean, not to cross-examine what you need to do in order to obviously avoid a situation like this again, because that's a conversation maybe for later. But I can tell you obviously have invested so much energy to really, trying to make it work with him too. And it just sounds like it's been hell, amongst other things. Because I know it's not always, as with all these cases, it's not always hell. It's got other dimensions to it. All right, let's continue. So Melissa writes, again, I asked about his marriage. Recently, he'd asked her why she'd ended things. She'd blamed his absence and lack of intimacy. Huh. While her reasons didn't surprise me, I wondered why he, Paul, 10 years post-breakup, still pressed her for reasons. Had he never gotten over her? Paul claimed he wanted to spend Christmas with me and the kids, but delayed asking them about it. Eventually, shortly before Christmas, his ex vetoed our plans and they spent a family Christmas together. He threw me an awkward extra Christmas the following day. His mum officially welcomed me into the family. She said she was happy for Paul's life finally to turn out for the better. He gave me concert tickets for summer, a meaningful gesture since he had attended the same concert with his ex the year before. Around New Year's Eve, he suggested I terminate my lease and move in with him. Oh dear. To anyone who's been listening to letters from me, you'll know that's always a bit of a scary sign. Everything was fine for some time, but I felt insecure. Paul often cuddled me with the kids as if using them as a shield to keep me at arm's length. Ugh. He reassured me, I'm bad at showing feelings and things will work out. A few times, feeling desperately lonely caused me to kind of withdraw from them without being able to do anything about it. I apologized and told him that it was my insecurity playing tricks on me. He acted empathetic, but once he insinuated that my closing down made the kids feel insecure. As my notice was running out, I asked him if he wanted me to move in, and he said yes. At this point, he often withheld sex, claiming to be tired. He dragged out bedtime by either falling asleep with Benjamin or going for long evening walks by himself. One night, I told him how lonely I felt and asked him to help me connect with the kids. He promised to try and started crying. He said I guess I have to learn to let them go. I clarified that I didn't want him to let them go, just to include me more. I suggested therapy, and he said, maybe. He said, nobody has ever known me as well as you do. Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. In the morning, I asked if we were okay, and he said yes. 1 hour later, he texted from work that he needed time alone with the kids and to see how they felt about me. As all of his breakups had started with quote unquote, I need some time alone, I panicked and called him. He was hostile and cold. Scared, I agreed to reduce our time together. Spring brought more challenges: my mum's hospitalization, my beloved dog's death, and tensions in Paul's family. I noticed his eyes looked empty and watery. I asked if he was okay, and he said, I feel nothing and don't know what to do about us. I urged him to stick to his promise to work through things together. He agreed. For my birthday, I treated him and the kids to dinner. Days later, Thomas excluded me from his own 20th birthday, saying he wanted to celebrate with his mum and dad. On our next date, Paul told me he needed peace as he found it difficult even to tolerate the kids. He said he envied me for not having kids and being able to do whatever I wanted. Crying heavily, he asked me to move on as I deserved better than to wait for him. I suggested a break, but he refused, saying I could never trust him. I felt sorry for him as he seemed deeply depressed. When I returned to collect my belongings a week later, he acted cheerful and casual as if nothing had even happened. Hurt and confused, I texted that what he had done wasn't okay. Good on you. He didn't reply. A month later, I reached out again, begging to give us a chance, but he remained silent. Living in the same small town, just seeing his car triggers anxiety attacks that last for days. All right, I need to take just a moment just to breathe. Amy, do you want to just share your thoughts off the back of this?
Oh my goodness. I'm catching my breath as well. Like I said, Melissa, this reads like a tragic love story, and this is your real life, and I'm so sorry for that. Um, this is so sad, and I understand why you wrote this letter and why you wanted somebody to discuss it and validate your experience because it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
All of the back and forth and the sadness and the almost getting this feeling I imagine you were experiencing of almost getting to a place where things were finally good and you were together and there was no question and you couldn't get there. And this is such a common experience, and this is one of the things that makes breakups with people with avoidant attachment so painful is that they are usually not based on a lack of love. And they are also usually not based on true incompatibilities. They are
No.
usually based on perceived insurmountable things on the avoidance part, which in reality are so easy to work out if only a simple, vulnerable conversation was had. And the thing is, and this is so clear in so many points of this letter, Paul clearly has a big problem or a big lack of ability to vulnerably communicate with everyone in his life. Now, interestingly, he seems to be pretty vulnerable with you, which is beautiful and wonderful, but he doesn't seem to have the skills to get his house in order, meaning draw some healthy boundaries with his ex-wife, communicate with his kids in a way that is healthy and productive. And it's sad because none of these problems seem insurmountable. I presume that he could have had a conversation with his sons, with the one who was excluding you, to get to the root of why his son was acting like that and perhaps work it out. And I think it would be more than reasonable for him to have had a conversation with his ex-wife where he says, hey, listen, I'm seeing someone, she's met the family, she's met the kids. And so, for my happiness and that out of respect for my partner being you, Melissa, I'm going to have to draw some boundaries. And it doesn't seem like any of this happened. And I suspect from his language, from his emotionality toward you in all of these breakups, I think he's also very heartbroken to break up with you. And I think I just get the strong sense that he feels so desperately disempowered to communicate with people in his life, to organize things in a way that actually makes him happy. And that is so sad because it is so possible, but avoidant people often feel incredibly disempowered to work through conflict in a healthy way. Why? Because they were not modeled this. And that is why avoidant people tend to seem to be searching for the perfect partner all the time and seem to sort of leave at the smallest, hint of a problem because they don't know how to work through it. And one other thing, you know, you mentioned that he's depressed several times in this letter, and that is also tied to what I was just saying, this lack of ability to vulnerably and authentically express himself, that often leads to depression. A lot of people say the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's expression. And if you think about that, how much sense does that make? And then it makes sense when you understand that people with avoidant attachment very often suffer from depression. And
Hmm.
maybe that is because they feel like they cannot express. They don't have the tools to, they don't know that they can, they don't know that it's appropriate. And of course, that prevents them from fulfilling healthy relationships and from many other things in life. What do you think, Ken?
I couldn't agree more. Like, honestly, I have to say, it's rare that a letter moves me. Like, not because letters don't move me, they do, but it's rare for me to get into this feeling of just like despair, sadness. And I'm feeling very impacted by this letter on the basis that I feel, and maybe it's the transference in the letter, meaning that I'm absorbing some of like the energy and the emotion from the way this letter is written. I just feel like this is just so sad. Like it just feels like this is like other letters, I'm like in a bit of a, a joined bit of a rage on behalf of the client too, or the client, Jesus, the letter writer, where like I'm feeling like the energy being like, yeah, fuck them, this is not okay. But with this, yeah, yeah, like of course, Paul's obviously done a lot of stupid fucking shit, but the way this is written makes me feel like for Melissa, you are not in that stage of anger, not yet, at least based on what I'm reading. At the time that this is being written, I feel like you're very much in that mourning phase. And I'm even feeling like some of that coming out of my own chest space, my heart. Like, I really feel like, oh, we're really in the mourning stage for just how sad this is, aren't we? Because, there's so much here about the tragedy of Paul and his life, the lack of boundaries, his kids who are now experiencing generational trauma. It just, I'm just sad for everyone involved. And I'm really sorry that you've gone through this, Melissa, because it just feels like it's so unfair. And it's just like, you obviously have a lot of love for this guy. I can tell just by reading this, and I suspect he does too. But it really just sounds like this is, it's been a Herculean effort to try and make this work. Now, with that being said, I'm very happy to go through some of the questions that you put here, but there is some feedback that I just want to say. I worry that at times you may have excused a lot of Paul's functional behavior from time to time out of a place of maybe fawning it from time to time, or also, not sticking up for your own needs because you were scared. Valid. That's just something to look into for yourself too. But I do feel like there's a layer of fear in being able to, express yourself from time to time with this experience. And I can't speak, heavily where that might be coming from, but just saying for future thought, definitely sounds like, there was, moments where you may not have felt safe to express yourself the way that you would have liked, or to stand up for yourself and have boundaries yourself from time to time. That's just one observation I have. But again, going back to what you've written, like I really feel there's like a lot of heavy emotion here from you, which, is totally valid given the circumstances.
Yes. And oh God, I just want to say I am so also feeling that in my chest and heart space, Ken. It's so palpable. Um, and yeah, Melissa, it is so hard to see the forest through the trees.
Oh
It
yeah.
is so hard to, catch these things as they're happening, especially if you have even a little bit of anxious attachment, even if you're mostly secure. And especially when someone is showing you such loving behavior. But I totally agree with Ken in that, for our own self-protection and for the preservation of our most precious resources, which are our time and our heart, space, love, force, energy, all of that for the preservation of those things, um, we really have to be so keen on people's patterns. And and he did show early on this pattern of leaving and then returning and leaving and returning. And this one, it gets so many of us. Why? Because of the sincerity on the avoidance part of being apologetic and of them expressing feelings towards you. And the thing is, I think they mean it in those moments. So you have someone in front of you who's leaving, but then they're coming back and apologizing and saying, yeah, I have all these strong feelings for you. I want to be with you. And so, of course, you want to believe them with every ounce of your soul. But then it inevitably happens again. And like Ken, you alluded to earlier, it is so, so common, I would say more common than not, that this sort of thing happens again right before or after a conversation is had about some sort of plan, moving in, an engagement, a long vacation. And it looks like that might have been what sparked his last disconnection, which again is very sad.
I completely agree. So we go to some of Melissa's questions now. The first one is, could I have saved the relationship if I'd behaved differently, especially whether my quote unquote freezing incidents or asking for more closeness may have triggered him? I have a very blunt answer to this one, but before I share, Amy, what are your thoughts?
I think we're going to share the same answer, and
I
the answer
agree.
is a capital N O. Um,
Yeah,
no, it's very important for you to know that, Melissa. Very important for you to know that we cannot heal people. We can always add to the dynamic of a healthy relationship. And I think you showed up very compassionately and patiently. You were very understanding. And asking for closeness, I did not get one sense in any word of this letter that you were activating in an anxious way, in that you were asking for too much closeness or being unreasonable or asking for too much reassurance. Not at all. I think this is absolutely 100% his wounding. What do you think, Ken?
I agree. Look, hell no. Like this was inevitable. But I do think I'm going to go back to what to what Amy and I were saying, Melissa, which is to say, whilst you may not have displayed the traditional patterns of someone who has those loud protest, behaviors of extreme emotionally manipulative behavior, quadruple texting, trying to isolate your partner from seeing anyone, like stopping Paul from being with any woman. I think you actually repressed a lot of your own emotional needs throughout this experience. I think also, to be fair to you, you may not have been familiar with what attachment styles are, because even as I'm reading this, it sounds like you may not have been familiar with like the lay of the land or the language around this. It may have been like going into a forest where you're like, where's the roadmap for this? And that's fine. That's like stuff you learn and you figure out. But I've got to be honest, like putting the knowledge gaps to one side, I really feel like there was a lot of, putting your needs dead last to accommodate Paul throughout this. And you just got to be careful of that because in addition to the red flags, which again, you may not have known, I just worry that, your energy and your heart was taken for a massive ride throughout this experience. Your next question is, has he ever gotten over his divorce? He once called his ex-wife a bitch and said and she had said, the ex-wife had said that Paul had treated her badly. And she had also treated him badly in return. My short answer is no. Just no, because because like there's a difference between co-parenting with someone where everything's pretty clandestine and also highly, highly, highly boundaried for the protection of, the kids and also the individual parents involved. But with this, there was no boundaries. There was no, he's still just at this woman's beck and call. To me, like, absolutely not. What are your thoughts, Amy?
I agree. And the thing is, I agree. And I don't think that that necessarily means that he is still deeply in love with his wife, or even in love with her, or even wants to get back together with her. But your question is, has he ever gotten over the divorce? And that's a separate thing. And I agree with you, Ken. I don't think he has. And you can kind of sense that again in all of the behaviors that Ken was just repeating, but also in his language where he said, she left out of the blue. She cheated on me and left out of the blue. What that tells me is they must not have had very many conversations explaining and going over the relationship dynamics and people's needs and were they being met and the state of the relationship, the state of the union, if he felt like he was left out of the blue. And, perhaps his wife might have an avoidant attachment style as well, where she didn't communicate those things and then she cheated and she didn't give it a fair shot. Um, but I'm not really getting a sense of closure, definitely not getting a sense of healthy dynamics, that would insinuate that he has completely moved on from this.
Agreed. I think my speculation would be that I think she probably mirrors dynamics that were familiar to him from his mum, which is why I made that assumption earlier. And I think I was on the money with that one. But the other thing I was also going to say, which was interesting, didn't Paul at one stage say something to the effect of, my ex-wife apparently cited that I was emotionally distant and didn't provide intimacy. In my experience of working with anxious partners who are still engaged with avoidant partners, is that if they're dealing with someone, if they're engaging with someone who's not providing that intimacy, the anxious partner may highly likely cheat on the avoidant partner. They will seek out a new partner to satisfy them emotionally because they're not getting it in the primary relationship. They'll have an affair. Like it just happens. And I would say that that comment to me, like again, Amy was speculating that, the wife might have an avoidant attachment style. And yes, it's true that two avoidance, one usually does cheat as well, and the other partner as well. But the fact that that partner had actually said that makes me think, I wonder if actually she might, have an anxious attachment style. Who knows? The other thing I also wondered too, oh, there was something that you had said, Amy, as well. Maybe it'll come back to me. But yeah, I just think that there's something about this dynamic which definitely sounds unresolved to me. And oh, that was what I was going to say. We also don't know how honest he's being with himself about the relationship, right? Because he's saying she left out of the blue, she cheated on him. Well, what are also avoidance known for doing as well? Leaving out of the blue, cheating on their partners. And I'm not here to say that one attachment style does this more than the other. Like that happens, regardless. But I know that some avoidant attachers do not have a good grasp of reality from time to time. Anxious attachers don't usually either for different reasons. I mean, it's all stemming from a lot of emotional neglect, and I'm being very reductive here. But the point is that I almost wonder if he's not being entirely honest with the state of affairs of the relationship, and he's just giving you a very impression managed, view of like, well, my wife cheated on me, and she also just left me out of the blue. Maybe she did. I don't want to take that away from him. Maybe she did, but I feel like he's not giving you a lot of other necessary information here. What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's very possible that his wife might have an anxious attachment style, and it's unfortunately true that, insecure attachment styles often I would say, are more likely than securely attached people to cheat if
Agree.
they feel like their needs aren't getting met in a relationship. And this happens for so many reasons, but one of the main reasons is that, um, you know, let's take one of the reasons why avoidant people cheat. Well, they feel disempowered to communicate their needs and their boundaries and their likes and dislikes in relationship. And so they feel like their needs aren't getting met because their partner isn't really aware of them. And at the same time, they feel like they don't have to communicate them, that it's not their job, that it's not part of a healthy relationship. And so they feel, well, this person is just not for me. And instead of having the vulnerable breakup conversation, or instead of, making up their mind, they cheat. So, this could have happened here. Um, but in any case, it sounds like and it actually sounds also like from his wife's end that she might not be over this either. If she's leaning
Oh,
on him for constant emotional support, if she's insisting that he go on vacations with her, if she's, insisting on having holidays together. I mean, I completely agree in conscious uncoupling and having the healthier the dynamic for the kids, the better, even if there are no kids, but this doesn't seem like that. It seems like an unhealthy, lack of boundaries, messy situation.
the word mess came to my mind as well, too. I'm on the same page as you. Last question from Melissa. I wonder if he might suffer from bipolar, borderline, or ADHD. What do you think? Short answer is maybe. And it goes back again to my own ethical boundaries around this, which is I can't provide a diagnosis for any of those because I'm not trained or allowed to do that as an Australian counsellor. In terms of speculating, I mean, we can definitely give it a bit of a crack. Bipolar is a mood disorder that's characterized by mania. So I didn't really hear any signs that he was having any manic episodes. Depression, oh yeah, that was definitely there. But I didn't hear any signs that he was having like these moments where he was like starting all these like business plans, working to try and, have all these like different financial schemes and stuff. I know you mentioned in the beginning that I think he said he worked in sales, self-employed salesman. Yeah. So, you know, it's not to say that, certain people with mood disorders or personality disorders do well in those kinds of roles where it's very high intense, high risk, high reward. That can definitely be a fit for people with bipolar and borderline, but I don't think that you could make that claim like across the board as a generalization. There's so much more to bipolar. Borderline, I'm going to say no on the basis that I feel like there would be a lot more instability for that to be a diagnosis present. I mean, again, that's a very conscientious, wrong word. Contentious, controversial diagnosis on the basis that it's often misdiagnosed and it's often poorly understood. And I think it can be just, people like, can misdiagnose people all the time, being like, oh, well, this person's emotionally dysregulated, therefore they have BPD. And it's like, well, not entirely true. Could, but I feel like there'd have to be some other stuff. I feel like he'd have to have a lot of emptiness inside of him. You'd have to look at the criteria of borderline for more of a consistent record of that. And lastly, ADHD, again, maybe, but nothing in this really screamed ADHD to me. And by the way, I know, Amy, you're like, you're not a clinician in the sense, but yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah. Again, I'm not, clinically qualified to diagnose any of these things, but I really agree with everything you said, Ken. Nothing in this, and again, sometimes Ken and I have conversations and read letters, and we are saying, "Oh, wow, we really think that this might be going on here. There might be some borderline here, or narcissistic personality disorder," but nothing in this letter of Paul's behavior is indicative of any of these things to me. Again, maybe ADHD might be the most likely thing because it's the least obvious thing as far as what we know in this letter. But nothing is indicating that to me. Like Ken said, bipolar is sort of known for these highly intense manic episodes and then followed by very intense low episodes. And I'm not really getting that here. And that's different from this avoidant hot and cold. It's very, very different. Which this sounds more like what Paul's experience is this battle between his feelings and fears. And then with borderline, like Ken said, there's usually a vast sense of emptiness and lack of personal identity, coupled with a severe fear of abandonment. And as we can tell here, Paul does not seem to suffer from a fear of abandonment. In fact, he seems to suffer from a fear of commitment. So yeah, I'm not really getting the sense that any of those are at play.
The last thing I'll say too on the BBD side of it is, and this is me just cheating and looking on Google. I know there's other things like spending sprees, unsafe sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. And sure, he ticked off a few of those in terms of like, it seemed like he's got an alcohol problem. But I mean, he's also going through a lot of stress at home. So it seems like that's his way of navigating and dealing with the stress there. There's also lots of other things too, like unstable relationships with friends, family, and loved ones. And I mean, avoidant attachers can also have that as well too, because their interpersonal skills are, obviously they struggle because of their inability to usually connect deeply because of their own fears and defensiveness. And then mood swings. This is a big one. I just didn't really get big mood swings from this guy. I got fear. I got lots of anxiety episodes, but I did not feel like there was these like big mood swings. I feel like if you were looking for like big mood swings, we'd be looking for someone who's, going from a place of like stability to instability very quickly. Like we're looking at someone who's very irritable and moody, like a lot of the time. And I'm not saying that. Look, I'm not an expert on BPD, so I don't think I'm really the right person to be, making that assessment. But to be completely honest, my answer is again, maybe. But also, professionally speaking, I often find having that extra, those extra diagnoses at times they can be helpful. But I think at the core, if we focus on the emotional stuff, like particularly the fear of commitment and the fear of intimacy, that shit was raging. And it's so much more apparent to me.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ken. And also, like you were just saying, to me, his mood was actually pretty consistent throughout the whole letter. And that is sort of this mood feeling of depression, of sadness, of yearning for closeness, but being afraid of it at the same time. And so I'm not really seeing a lot of variation or swinging from one extreme to the next. So yeah, I definitely agree. And and also I agree, sometimes these things can be helpful, but in this case, there is so much evidence in front of us that this is so largely an attachment issue that I don't think it would really provide extremely valuable context or really change anything in this case. And also, I just want to say, Melissa, like Ken was saying earlier, by no means is anything a cross-examination on your behaviors or actions during this, but there is so much value, and we really encourage you to just take a look at the places in you that felt most compelled to take him back when
Mm-hmm.
he came, because it is those exact places that you likely need to just turn inward and nourish and work on so that you don't feel like you need these things so desperately from someone else who is not showing up in the healthiest way. Because it seems throughout the letter that you understand this is not good. These behaviors are problematic. You tried to get away, you left, you moved, and you are sucked back in. And believe me, we understand more than most how easily that can happen. But take a look at those things and strengthen those things because it will only benefit you and it will only help your healing journey.
Amy, you and I are on exactly the same page. And just to round out here, my last 2 cents is just to say, Melissa, once again, I am so sorry that you've been through this experience because, look, Paul just sounds messy. And messy is a word I often use to describe a lot of these cases because that's what it is. I don't think Paul's a bad guy. He just seems like he's really struggling with a lot of his own wounding, and it's sad. And I can tell there's obviously been a lot of love joined between the two of you. It's just unfortunate that this is, where it's now come to. And I'm sorry that you both are in this position too, because it's just terrible. I think, given the fact that you're probably in that early stage of grieving, that you're probably not at the stage where you're probably feeling angry at the way Paul behaved. And you may not get there for a bit. That's fine. It's just, how it usually rolls. But I just want to circle back to what Amy was saying and say, in your own time, when it's appropriate, definitely even go over this letter and just look at it because you'll come to a place where you're like, how the hell did I get involved with someone like this? It's a phase. You'll get to it eventually. So yeah, just sort of rounding out. Amy, is there anything you want to share just as we're finishing?
Yes, I just wanted to say, and this is related to what you were just saying, while we completely feel for Paul, and it is so evident that there is some attachment trauma, generational trauma, a whole bunch of stuff going on, depression, um, two things have to be true at the same time. And these two things are We have empathy and compassion for Paul, and we understand the likely origins and explanations for his behaviors. And we don't think he's a bad person. We think he's just wounded. And at the same time, you have to have just as much and more empathy and compassion for yourself and not ever let someone else's wounding be an excuse for unhealthy behaviors or give you a reason to feel so sorry for them or have so much compassion for them that you put your own needs and boundaries and pain aside because we can explain the behavior. And that's something that Ken and I want to make so clear to listeners. It is really good and helpful to understand where people are coming from. And at the same time, we always have to protect ourselves first. And wounding isn't an excuse for behavior. And people can be emotionally unhealthy and not safe partners and still not be bad people. So that's just a reminder for everyone listening to protect yourselves.
Protect your heart because you've only got one, and it's easier said than done, but you got to do it. And you got to get to a point of being quite ruthless. Like the last thing I'll say on this too is Paul absolutely deserves love from a therapist, but not from you. Not in this context. Like, yes, you're more than welcome to love him, but it'll be to your detriment because you already know what this is like. It's not to say he's unworthy. It's not to say he's unlovable. It's just to say he can't do intimacy right now, and it's killing you both at this particular point in time. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining this letter reading. It was lots of fun. Well, not fun's not the right word. Tragic would probably be the more appropriate word for this one. And we look forward to coming back again for a future letter reading. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.